because I stand for the opposite interests in the society, the people who you exploit. And that really gathered steam. So there's a breaking of the consensus, which is, I think, very, very important, because it means when you look at Britain, you have far less of a sense of that. And one of the reasons is that despite Ed Miliband and the British Labour Party saying that they're coming to Bradford to listen and so on, the British Labour Party, and certainly as its front bench, we all know that there are some good people inside the Labour Party, but certainly the front bench, the people who set the tone, the direction of the Labour Party, remain on the extreme right, as it were, of social democratic parties, of left-of-centre parties in Europe. They're way to the right of anything that the French Socialist Party is saying, their equivalent. They're to the right of even what's the German equivalent of the Labour Party is saying. The British Labour Party is to the right, in other words, is more Tory than the Treasury Secretary of Barack Obama in the United States, who's done more, not enough by any means, to say, let's retreat from austerity and let's look at an alternative in an extremely mild way. And I think this is where I wanted to sum up, really. I think this has some important longer-term implications for us in respect, which I think then feed into the areas of work that the Manchester election campaign will be involved in, the People's March, in a sense, called by the TUC that George was talking about this morning, this attempt to have hundreds of thousands, 1 million people on the streets of London at the end of this year, which is not just us wanting that and us working for it, but very significant other organisations inside of Britain, the British trade unions and many community organisations and so on, will be looking to, or can be looking to that day as a day when we stand up and say no to all of this, no to what the government is doing. And it has implications for all of that, because it means that what we're saying is a version, very close version in fact, to what's being said by people who, for all sorts of reasons, are even more electorally successful than Respect in Britain. Because we know the limitations of the electoral system in Britain, also the tradition which says that you should really look to the Labour Party despite everything that it's done to you. So some of those traditions and electoral systems are weaker inside Europe, and there are also bigger organisations than us inside Europe, in Greece and France and in Germany and in other countries. So I think the sense that we are saying, Bradford, in Manchester, in East London, we're saying in Britain that we are part of a European-wide, and indeed beyond Europe, resistance where we can, making arguments where we can, resistance where we can take some form of action, demonstrative action or other forms of action, and resistance at the ballot box, which is shared across Europe. I think this is really very, very important for us. I think it certainly has implications if we're looking at the electoral cycle that Clive was outlining this morning, where there's elections for the European Parliament in 2 years' time, because I think we have a vision of what we would say in a European election campaign, which is, in London, for example, a city where there are people from all over the world, from all parts of Europe, saying we stand together with all of those different people represented on a list, represented as a part of a political campaign, just as they were in Bradford, different origins and nationalities and what have you, all saying we stand together against this austerity, not that we go for the UKIP, Little Englandism, blame the people who live in another country, or the colour of their skin or the colour of their passport is different, and so on. I think we need to think about how, in all sorts of different respects, we give voice to that feeling. In council chambers where we have a presence, in the media, through campaigning, because one of the awful lessons of what's happening in parts of Europe is that if that progressive voice, which is 100% against war and imperialism, and therefore against all forms of racism and never gives a concession to racism or xenophobia, if that voice isn't giving voice to the people who are suffering, then other nasty, backward-looking, vile voices will. And despite the fact that those voices, or the most extreme of those voices, have been pushed back a bit in Britain, we all know, just to look at the horrendous response over what was already a tragedy in Rochdale with the sex abuse case, how that can suddenly bubble up out of the sewer and people can be diverted to blame their next-door neighbours. Crucially, the question of Palestine. And it is something which is very central to, in a sense, the political personality of Respect, because the issue of Palestine over the last 6 years in particular has become, if you like, the leitmotif, the example around the world for a global struggle against injustice, the outstanding example of what imperialism, inequality and injustice does to a people. And in a sense, we have the diametrically opposed position to Ed Miliband. Sushma this morning said that whenever we're talking about government, the Tory government policy, local councils and so on, we should recall what Labour's saying. Well, Ed Miliband, in fact, said there's no place in politics for anyone who questions the existence of the State of Israel. Which means that there's no, if that's literally taken to be a fact, there's no place in politics for very large numbers of people in Britain. No place in politics for people who make the legitimate, I believe correct and certainly historically justified point that the State of Israel was founded upon Palestinian land and that an exclusivist state built by something like the Jewish National Fund, which is there to rob Palestinian land, will mean the continued expulsion of the Palestinians. And I think that the issue is important because it carries with it the conviction, it carries with it the principle, which again speaks to a wider number of people. So in Bradford, I don't believe that 18,000 people voted for Respect and George Galloway because of the issue of Palestine, but many hundreds and thousands of people were motivated to campaign because we've stood up over that question despite the fact that mainstream politics has capitulated. And despite the fact that there's now an effort to really expunge Palestine, an effort to talk about, if you look at the Western governments, the Israeli government and so on, they're talking a lot about the Middle East, but the word Palestine barely crosses their lips. So for example, earlier this year, 7 weeks ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, was in Washington for 3 days. He spoke about Iran, he spoke about what his preferred outcome was in Egypt, he spoke about Syria. The word Palestine didn't mention, didn't cross his lips. I think one of the things certainly that Viva Palestina is about, and I think Respect is about as well, is reinserting the question of Palestine. And that's important in the wider developments of what's happening in the Middle East, the point that Winston raised about the attitude to what's happening in Syria and to Bashar al-Assad. We all are against the violence in Syria. None of us have any sympathy or support for a government which maintains itself in power through repressive measures. Is that why William Hague, Hillary Clinton and President Hollande are talking about Syria on the basis that they're opposed to governments, particularly in the Middle East region, who oppress their own people and expunge democracy? No, because the government of William Hague and David Cameron 13 days ago re-established arms sales to Bahrain, re-established arms sales to a dictatorship which is killing its own people. They've never suspended arms sales to Saudi Arabia, a dictatorship which is not only killing its own people and people in Bahrain, but is looking to annex Bahrain to be part of the Saudi Arabian state, something which when Saddam Hussein did it in 1990 led to the war against Iraq and the subsequent sanctions on the Iraqi people and so on. Are they critical or in opposition to the government of Bashar al-Assad because it's not done enough to liberate the parts of Syria which is occupied by Israel, the Golan Heights which are occupied by Israel, or that the Syrian government's not done enough to support the Palestinians? No, They're opposed to it because, in their view, it's done too much to support the Palestinians, because it stood with the people in Lebanon, stood with Hezbollah and stood with Hamas when Hamas was expelled from Qatar, expelled from Jordan, and so on. And so I think the critical question that you raised, Winston, is that in this country, and I know many friends, have many Arab friends in this country, Lebanon, and in Syria, there are many debates about exactly what's happening in Syria and so on. I think in this country we have to start from the fact that when William Hague, Cameron, and for that matter Ed Miliband, all of whose parties supported the Iraq War and all of whom are responsible for Britain's imperial policy towards the Middle East, they are the last people in the world to say anything about democracy, freedom and liberty inside Syria, and certainly not at the point of a Western gun or drone or so-called no-fly zone and what have you. I think this is where we have to start. There's a second aspect as well, which is that the forces, the governments which are allied to the West inside of the Middle East are deliberately stoking the poison of sectarianism. So that you see the Saudi government is saying, down with the Shia Alawi government in Syria, the different branches of Islam. Down with the Shia Persians in Iran. And this is having an impact in some communities around the world. And I think one of the things that we stand for in terms of standing for unity is to reject this attempt to divide Muslim against Muslim, to divide anybody against anybody. And the message of the Viva Palestina convoy is that we were travelling to Gaza under the flag of Palestine, which stands higher than any Arab dispute, any Muslim dispute, and we're not prepared to see these vital questions dragged into the mire of those people who want to divert us from what the key questions are. And I think that's an important stance that we take. The final point was really on the question of racism and anti-racism and things being a turning point. It was very, very good to be reminded that 11 years ago, wasn't it, that in Clayton, the British National Party were able to get, was it one or maybe more than one, two, I think it was, wasn't it, two councillors elected in the Clayton area, whereas this time round, in that ward, Respect was able to get the largest numbers of votes. And I think we have to recognise two things. One is that we will never give an inch to any form of sectarianism, any form of racism. The points that Milena made about that, I think, are very important, and that's some issue, some arena which we have definitely got something to contribute to a wider European discussion, including with people who are more successful on the electoral terrain, but I don't think have quite the same level of understanding or depth of understanding that we've been able to develop together in Respect. So we never give an inch, at the same time as we find every possible way to engage with those people who are not themselves British National Party or hardened racists, but are confused because they've faced this barrage of propaganda all the time, so that we're absolutely unyielding over the question, yet we reach out to try and win people who don't yet see things exactly the same way that we do. And that was what was done in the Bradford campaign, and I think can be done in the Manchester campaign as well. And people spoke about turning points. I think we are at a turning point. There was a turning point in the 1930s and 40s, which eventually led to a kind of form of settlement, which led to the expansion of the welfare state for 20, 30 years, universal education, free university education and so on. There was another turning point in the 70s into the 80s of Thatcher and Reagan and the era of privatisation, the era now of austerity. I think we are at a turning point of which direction society goes in. I think as Respect we have to seek to make those arguments and seek to have an impact where we can win directly, but also force these ideas into the political spectrum. They'd like, as Carol mentioned, they'd like to just besmirch George, besmirch Respect. Immediately after the Bradford election, they tried to say, first of all, oh, it was a freak result. Then it was just the Muslims that did it. Then they had a report that's gone to the Labour Party hierarchy to say what went wrong in Bradford. Now they think it's just a question of how many tweets they send out and how often Ed Miliband comes up here. But we've had an impact in the thinking in politics, and the more we press on, I think the more we can grow as a party, different experiences in different areas of the country, but also have a bigger impact so that we can start to get these ideas, this way forward, back at the centre of the British political debate rather than pushed to one side.